Hey friends, welcome everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on Azure Data Factory. Today we would be discussing a couple of concepts which are related to Microsoft Azure Data Factory. My name is Kuldeep Singh and I'll be your host today for discussion of this quick webinar. So let's get started. As far as today's webinar is concerned, we would be discussing a couple of concepts down there, which would include Microsoft Azure Data Factory quick overview, which would also talk about top level concepts associated within Data Factory. How do we create an Azure Data Factory, followed by a quick demonstration, a quick hands-on over there. Then we'll be having some questions and answers discussed right across in there. So let's quickly start up with today's agenda and start working with this particular webinar in here. So when we talk about Azure Data Factory, that comes up with four major concepts down there. That comes up with data collections, transformations. We would be discussing all about that. But in terms of quickly on Azure Data Factory, in today's world where data abundance is at the top, where data growth is quite exponential, whether it is your relational data, whether it is your non-relational data, whether it's your organized, unorganized, semi-structured, unstructured data down there. So however, on its own, when you talk about raw data that doesn't have the proper concept for analysis, for data scientists, for decision makers, we cannot do proper analysis on the raw data out there. For that particular approach, you need to have some sort of analysis tools and techniques with you to start working on data transformation approach in there. So the Azure Data Factory just does that. So for example, it is a cloud-based ETL service and it is used for data integration as well that will allow you to create data-driven workflows. Of course, for orchestrating your data movement and transforming your data at scale. When we talk about Azure Data Factory down here, that has got multiple components which we can involve. So let's talk about them one by one. The very first major area when we talk about Azure Data Factory is collect and connecting to the different sources. So when we talk about data can be present in various forms at multiple data sources down there. It could be in form of an HTTP data source, raw text, relational, binary large objects available at all different places out there. So the very first phase talks about connecting to those different data sources and collecting that data to start operating on some sort of data flows or some sort of analysis out of that. So when we talk about connect and collect, we discuss about the types of data, what kind of data we want to bring in our Azure Data Factory for further processings. Apart from that, because the data is on separate sources down there, different data sources available, different forms of data available. So the first phase talks about connecting and collecting data right across from those different sources down there. Moving to the second one, we talk about the transformation. So when we talk about transformation, we majorly talks about introducing our data flows, selecting that data, applying some filters on top of it, joining data from multiple sources, syncing data to my target sources down there. We can always have external activities involved down there in terms of scriptings and all those things coming across when we talk about transformation on Azure Data Factory. We also discuss about publishing. So since it's a cloud-based services available on Microsoft Azure, it's a native Azure service down there for ETL processes down there. So we need to publish our changes, whether we are creating some pipelines or data flows out there, and that will involve introduction of our CI/CD pipelines for continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines. If being an organization, we are using Azure DevOps down there, or DevOps operations, GitHub Enterprise Git down there, or Visual Studio Team Services. We would like to automate our build and release pipelines for some sort of data movement. We would like to achieve that orchestration after data mapping flows are completed. So we can also have some BI tools achieving reports, views, and visualizations out of that when we talk about the publishing segment down there. And once we do that, the last but not the least, we talk about data monitoring. So when we talk about monitoring phase in our Azure Data Factory, we talk about our pipeline monitoring, how many times we've executed the pipeline, what was the status of that execution, what's my health panels currently as far as my data sources are reachable or not. So we talk about these major functionalities out there. So whenever we talk about introducing Azure Data Factory, we talk about in a sequential manner. Number one, we connect and collect the data from various data sources. Then we do the transformation approach down there by introducing data flows, control flows, some of the external activities. Then we talk about our publishing of those changes, publishing my pipelines, working up with my BI tools down there. And finally, we start working on the monitoring segment where we can have our health monitoring, we can have our pipeline monitorings down there with Azure Data Factory. So more important to understand, people used to have data analysis with lots of tools down there. It could be your Oracle BI down there. It could be your SQL Server analysis services, could be data warehousing tools and techniques associated. But one of the major differences we approach when we talk about Azure Data Factory, in case of your on-premise solutions, we used to have a process called ELT down there, and that is referred as extract, load, and transform. We extract the data from multiple sources, we load it to our data warehousing, and then we transform the data based on the needs by involving our BI tools associated with that. Whereas when I talk about Azure Data Factory specifically, since it's a cloud-based service, the approach it does follow is pretty much the ETL. And when we talk about ETL, the first phase is extract, which talks about connecting and collecting the data. And then we talk about transform. We talk about the data transformations, applying various operations out there. And then we load the data to our target instances wherever we want the data to go. So that's one of the biggest difference when we talk about having your BI things in your on-prem sources, on-prem BI tools down there, or in your Azure Data Factory, which strictly follows the ETL protocol associated with that. At the same point of time, when we talk about some of the major concepts in case of Azure Data Factory, and of course, we would be discussing all those concepts in much more detail when we talk about how does these things work and how do we start utilizing. So we are discussing some of the top level concepts which will help you understand what these things are. How do you start using them in your day-to-day life when you're building your Azure Data Factory pipelines? One of the very first thing we are talking here is our pipeline. So ideally, a data factory might have one or more pipelines. You can have multiple pipelines in there. So what is a pipeline? So a pipeline is a logical grouping of activities. Whatever activities that are performing a unit of work together, we combine them into a logical pipeline. Okay. Those activities in a pipeline ideally perform a task. For example, a pipeline can contain a group of activities that is ingesting the data from multiple data sources and then running some HD Insight clusters query on them, the high queries, and storing them finally into a different Azure Data Lake store. Could be lots of examples. Combination of those activities will make a pipeline associated in here. The next but not the least, we talk about the mapping data flows. So when you talk about the data flows, you create and manage graph of data transformations. So any kind of things, once you copy data from multiple data sources, you would like to select that data, apply some filters over there, may want to do some joins over there, might want to perform n number of operations out there. That is something we do in our data flows. Don't worry about that. We would be doing these practically today as part of our demonstration out there. We talk about activities at the third step. When we talk about activities, it's a basic building block of a pipeline. So whatever the smallest logical unit what we are creating, which is performing a task, that's going to be an activity. For example, you want to use a copy activity, you want to use a data transformations, you would like to analyze your data. So the group of these data movements, data transformation and control activities we can always have as part of our Azure Data Factory. Another important concept down here is data sets. So when I talk about my data sets, as the name suggests, it represents what kind of data currently is there in my data stores, and I'm getting them and storing them somewhere in my data sets associations down here. Next in the segment, we talk about our linked services. Well, don't worry about it if we are a little bit confused as far as the naming convention goes of our linked services. So ideally, consider a linked service a connection to a different data store. For example, my data could be in any of my on-prem servers, file servers, SQL servers, maybe multiple services down there. My data could be on my Azure binary large objects. My data could be on my Amazon cloud, AWS cloud, Google cloud across multiple services. My data could be on different business applications down there. So to be able to fetch that particular data and have some operations performed on top of it, we first need to have a connection from our Azure Data Factory to that particular data source. Well, that is something what we achieve with the help of linked services down there. So that will help us understand and creating data connections with my linked services over there. We talk about the next concept here, which is my triggers. Well, as the name suggests, whenever your pipeline execution needs to be kicked off on a specific step, on a specific business logic, we can always apply our triggers on different type of events down there. We've talked about the next source, which talks about my pipeline runs. Well, once my pipeline is ready with all these components, activities, and everything, of course, we would like to execute that and like to say everything's working fine, want to debug my pipeline. So all these history jobs are stored inside my pipeline runs, which we can always do with the help of monitoring down there. The next in the segment is talking about the parameters in my Azure Data Factory. Well, the parameters are technically a key value pairs. It's a read-only configuration though. So when we talk about I've got a parameter name and I've got a parameter value associated there, which I can start using in my control flows or variables or all those things down together. So when we talk about control flows in here, it's pretty much an activities which can do sequencing, branching, defining those parameters at the pipeline level, passing those arguments, running loops for each iterators and all, we can always do with the help of a control flow. When we talk about the last thing, variables, very important, we can declare them and get some value stored in there, which we can further refer across our pipelines in Azure Data Factory. So these are some of my top level concepts which combinedly builds an Azure Data Factory pipelines, and we can pretty much have an end-to-end example discussing all these values associated in here. So once again, that was one of the quick things what we just discussed. So once again, an Azure Data Factory, which is a cloud-based service talking about my extract, transform, and load processes, the ETL processes, which I can pretty much use for orchestration of my data movement and my data transformation across in there. Now, considering the same thing, let's quickly have a demonstration which would talk about an Azure Data Factory, and I like to make it an end-to-end demo, practically working, creating an Azure Data Factory, adding some pipelines to that, working up with some of the activities, and start working with all those n number of top-level concepts what we discussed just now. For that, let me quickly take you to my demonstration. I'm going to open my browser in here, and let me open portal.azure.com. So at present, I'm logging into my Azure portal using my corporate credentials. So I'm already logged in. So that's taking me to my Azure portal. I'm having hundreds of resources already deployed in here. Just want to give you a couple of things before we start. Let's have some of the preparations and then we'll start using our data factory concepts down there. So as far as the subscriptions are there, my tenant does have multiple subscriptions associated. One of them is my A05, and that's the one which I would be utilizing for this part of demonstration. So let's go ahead. I'm going to do that everything from scratch when we talk about an Azure Data Factory demonstration. So let me create a new resource group over here. I'm going to add a resource group. Let me quickly add that. Then creating and working with Azure Data Factory right across. So let me select my subscription in which I would be putting up that. And I would like to call it my, let's call it a webinar ADF, the Azure Data Factory. And I'd like to review and create, just storing it at my nearest region down there, clicking on create. And technically I just created a resource group which would contain all the resources related to this particular webinar, what we are doing. Okay. Next in the segment is I would like to create a new Azure Data Factory, the instance of my Azure Data Factory where I can create and work with pipelines, data flows, working up with copy activities, data transformations, and all those things down there. So let me quickly go to my data factories in here. I already have one. I'll explain you that later on. At this point, let me click on add. So I'm actually adding a new data factory. Which resource group I'm going to utilize. Important thing, it's important to understand which subscription you're utilizing, and on top of it, what would be my resource group. Well, I would be deploying that at my East US region down here, and I would like to call it my AZ Weekends ADF 02. That's going to be the name what I would like to make it, AZ Weekends Azure Data Factory 02. I'm using the latest version V2 in here. Important thing before I go ahead, review and create. So when we talk about the Git configurations, so if you would like to store these activities, all that scripts and all as form of code in your Git repository, you can always have it, the GitHub configurations in here. You can have your Azure DevOps configuration as well. But at this point of time, let's say I'll be doing that later on. I'm disabling Git at this moment and I'm clicking on review and create. So technically, this will do all the validations, inclusive if you have some policies deployed on Microsoft Azure. So it's running those final validations. We'll quickly check that up. Once you're seeing a green tick, I'm going to create that instance of Azure Data Factory. Let me just do that. And I just submitted a deployment where my Azure Data Factory will be created. So in the meanwhile it is creating, let me take you back to the portal one more time. So what we just did so far, I created a resource group and I provisioned a new instance of Data Factory. The deployment has been submitted. In a couple of minutes down there, I would be seeing that deployment completed. So you can see that it's telling me my deployment is complete. I will come back to this particular area and review all those changes. In the meanwhile, let me take you to one of my existing data factory, which we've already created. Just for the reference purposes in here, let me click on that data factory real quick. And I can see some of the monitoring areas, runs, trigger runs, multiple things down there. On top of it, I'm clicking on author and monitor. The moment I click on author and monitor, I would be going to my Azure Data Factory, and this is the area where it says adf.azure.com, azuredatafactory.azure.com, followed by the resource group and the name of your Azure Data Factory, where we are currently in. And this is the page we would be discussing. So if I take you from an existing one, you will see I've got some pipelines, I've got some data sets, I've got some data flows. So now you see these were some of the technical terms we were discussing in the top level concepts of Azure Data Factory. And we can start creating these values across in there. So for this one, let me go to my newly created Azure Data Factory in here. And I'm clicking on author and monitor. It is going to open my Azure Data Factory portal workspace where I can start working, creating pipelines and all these values in here. So at the very first thing, you can see some of the quick videos from Microsoft about the same. You can have the tutorials in here if you would like to learn about Azure Data Factories. You've got some quick tasks over here where we can start working. I've got the home area, I've got my authoring workspace, I've got my monitoring workspace in here, and I've got my manage area down there. So we will be discussing all these four in today's demonstration. Let me quickly click on create a pipeline. This is an empty Azure Data Factory as of now. That's the one which we just created. So let me click on create pipeline. And this is taking me at multiple areas. Important thing, it is creating a new pipeline with the name called pipeline 1. And I would like to rename it. So let me just go ahead and rename that. I would like to make it GTL_ADF pipeline 01. Ideally should be a meaningful name. I'm just using it for demonstration purposes. That's fine. So this is the pipeline which we just created. Now you will notice that currently I've got my publish all area and I've got one in yellow. The number of objects which are unpublished are one as of now. If you would like to validate that, there are going to be some problems right now. I don't have any activities and anything. So you're seeing some validation errors in this particular area. We will revisit that, of course. Let me hide that particular area. This is the workspace where we would be working for creation of this ADF pipelines associated with that. Now, what is important to understand, how do we start utilizing and working up with ADF pipelines and then creating data sets and all, that's pretty much what we are discussing in here. So let's quickly take an example. I've got my pipelines area. I've got one pipeline over here. I've got my datasets area where I can create multiple datasets. I've got my data flows where I can start creating data flows right associated with that one. So let's do one by one. We would be doing a couple of things which will involve datasets, data sources, activities, transformations, and all those values in here. So at present, let's take an example what I'm actually doing in here. So I just created this pipeline and then I've got the list of activities over here. So this was one of the important one, and where I demonstrated, we talked about that a pipeline is a logical combination of activities. What kind of activities you might have? So you got the move and transform, you got different categories, an Azure function out here, a batch service, Azure Databricks, Data Lake Analytics, Hadoop Insight, some of the machine learning activities down there. So let's take an example. If I would like to copy some data, I've got a copy data activity. All I'm doing is just dragging it from here and dropping it to my workspace. And the moment I do, now you see some of the values coming up right across in here. Now, what I would like to call it, let me call it copy data from data source. Ideally should be a meaningful name, but I'm just using it for demonstration purposes in here. Now let's see what we are doing, what we are moving to the next step. I need to specify some of the steps in here, which are what is going to be the source. Now, one thing you would like to see at present, I've got only one pipeline over here. I've got 0 data sets and 0 data flows. So I would like to create a source data set. I've got nothing as of now. And now I would like to create one. So let me click new over here. That's the place from where I would be getting the data and start working across with that. So I can have multiple data sources over here, which we can start working and start creating those. So at present, I would like to get some data from somewhere. So in this particular example, let me quickly have my data source created and I would like to get my data right from there. So what is important in here, let's understand. I've got my AWS, I've got my Redshift, S3, MongoDB, Azure Blob. So you can see I've got Azure related sources, databases, files, generic down there, NoSQL, service and apps, multiple categories, business applications from where I can get my data. Let's say just as a beginning, when I go to files, I would like to have it from a HTTP source. When I click on that, so that's the place from where I will be having my data coming into this copy data activity. So let me click on continue. And what kind of data are we getting from there? That is going to be my delimited text, for example. That's the CSV in here. Let me click on continue. And now what's going to be the value? So let's call it a CSV from HTTPS, whatever you want to call it, whatever different source you would like to make it. Now I'm creating this data set from where my data will be coming up. I'm creating this data set, but then the question comes, since it is an HTTPS source, I have to connect that particular source, and any kind of connection, whether it's to your HTTPS source or your data lake account or your machine learning account or any of your business applications or AWS cloud or anything, that is called a linked service. So let's take an example. What I'm doing in here, I would be creating a new linked service over here that would be pointing to my HTTP. So let me call it, this is going to be my HTTP source 01, should be a meaningful name. And then we need to specify the URL right across in here. Before I do that, let me show you something. When I paste it, there is a sample file which is available on GitHub right across in there, which is giving me some sample movies data with their ratings and all those values coming up in here. I can pretty much save it to my desktop and we can use it from there. Or since I already have that URL over here, let me paste that particular URL. Important thing, does that follows any kind of authentication? Well, anonymously I was able to access it. So anonymous access, which is currently in there. Important, this is my linked service, which is connecting to the actual data source. Okay, let me create that. So I'm creating a linked service, and right from here, it will be getting the data. The first row would be a header over here. So that's what I'm specifying. The first row is going to be header associated in there. Let me quickly click OK, and let's see what happens next. Important thing, now you've got a pipeline over here. You've got a data set over here as well. The data set says 1, which I just created. Now, to see whether you're good, whether you're fine at this point of time or not, let's click on preview data. So when I click on preview data, we are actually fetching that data from the HTTPS source, which I just connected using a linked service, and bingo, there we are seeing all those values with the column headings because the first row was the heading and all the data was coming up right across. So I can see that that's what we have done so far. We have got that particular data associated in here. Okay, what is the next thing I might want to do? So I will come back to this Azure pipeline. You can see that I've got 3 different objects over here. I can see one pipeline. I can see one data set. I'm not seeing anything over here. So that makes 2 different objects. The third one is right over here where I've got the linked services, and I created one linked service there. So that's fine. I will publish them later on. Let me go back to my Azure portal real quick. And as part of my Azure portal, I would like to create a storage account over here where I would be dumping that data. For example, I got it from an HTTP source. Now I would like to store it to one of my Azure storage account or a data lake account or whatever we would like to create. So this is not about storage or data lake. So I will rather be a little bit quick on creating that particular details. So let's go ahead over here. And I would like to create one within the same subscription, the one which I just created, the resource group. The name of the storage account is going to be AZ Weekend Store 02. And this is what's going to be the name. I'm leaving all these options blank. We can pretty much spend 2 different hours, 2 complete hours explaining each and every one in much more detail. Important thing over here is when I'm moving to advanced, I would like to make it hierarchical within the data lake storage generation 2 or whatever we want to do that. Let me quickly create that storage account, which is having the data lake enabled, the version 2 enabled. So it is running some validations down there. And once that's completed, I'll create that and I'll be utilizing it for storing the data from that HTTP source to this Azure storage account and then performing some transformations over there. So I'm quickly clicking on create. So ideally this is another Azure service which we are provisioning right now. So I created an Azure Data Factory, and then I created an Azure storage account with data lake enabled out there. Why? Because the operation which I'm performing over here, which is getting data from an HTTP source, I would like to copy it to one of my storage accounts down there and then use it for further data transformation processes. So that's where I've deployed that. In the meanwhile, it is working. So let's see, it's working currently. It is creating. Let's go ahead in the meanwhile and talk about the sync parameters down there. Important thing to notice, when we clicked on that copy data activity, there was one in source and there was one in sync. What does that mean? That says that we are having some required parameters, what needs to be filled in on these different areas down there. Whenever you talk about a sync activity, there has to be at least one sync activity in your pipeline, which is putting that data somewhere. Is it for Azure Synapse Analytics for further streaming, or is it for Databricks for big data and all there, or is it for your data lake storage down there? Whatsoever, we might want to create that. In the meanwhile it is creating, you can see that my storage account got created. I've got the containers, file shares, tables, and queues in here. Let me click on the blob containers, the binary large object containers. And I'm creating one over here. I would like to call it GTL data with no anonymous access. Let me create that. And inside that particular container, I would like to create a new directory over here, would like to call it my data, for example. And let me click on save. Important thing to understand, I've got one storage account, I've got a blob, a directory inside that, and that doesn't have anything over here, no blobs whatsoever as of now. Let me move to my Azure Data Factory. And the next in the segment, we were talking about the syncing. So let's talk about the sync step over here. I would like to sync this data set somewhere. So I've got the data sets over there. I would like to create a new data set over there. So let me click on new over here. Important thing, I copied that from an HTTP source. Now where I'm actually gonna copy that. So that would be my Azure related service, and to be precise, the one which I created, my data lake storage generation 2, the one which I just created from scratch. Let me click on continue. Important thing, what type of data that's gonna be? Well, it's gonna be a delimited text, a CSV file, okay. I'm clicking on continue and we need to specify the value. So let's call it my Azure data lake storage 01, and I'm gonna have my linked service over there. So let's take it my destination data source, and my linked service, I will be creating one more connection now. So let's go ahead over here. It's going to be my Azure data lake. Important thing, I've got it on a different subscription, A05. I've got a data lake account, the one which I just created. I can test that connection, that everything's fine, everything's great in here. If we talk about multi-tenant or cross connection over there, I can have it using the connection strings as well. Well, let me create that linked service, a connection to my data lake storage. And once I'm done over here, we can specify all these values, like where I'm gonna have those values listed. So that's exactly right over here. I will be having a container that's going to be GTL data, and underneath that I've got a directory called my data. So let's go over there. I'm talking about GTL data. The directory is my data in here. We can talk about file and have all those values associated. We can have from where the schema will actually come up. So let's say the schema, it could be from my connection, or if you want to deliberately have it from somewhere, in case of XML, XSLT and all, you can have it manually as well from a sample file, for example. When you say a sample file, let me click on browse, and this time I'm getting the schema from my computer directly. So let me go to my desktop in here. I've got my multiple files over here. One of them is a CSV file, which contains the same schema as I copied it from the HTTP source. Let me click open. So this is from where the sample, the schema is gonna come up. The first row would be treated as header. All right, in here, what I'm doing next is I'm clicking OK. So actually I configured a destination data set. Important thing to notice, what kind of file will get created and have all those values listed up in here. So is it going to be a .txt extension, a .csv extension, a .xml? It's all up to you. Let me just use a .text as of now, from a CSV, transforming that to a plain text file with comma delimited values. So I created this particular activity in here. Next thing I'm going to do over here is I would like to check that whether it's working fine or not. So that's one of my copy activity. Let me quickly click on validate first. So when I say validate, on the right hand side, I'm not seeing any warnings over here. I'm not seeing any errors over here. So as far as the step is concerned, my pipeline has been validated. The next step I'm doing is I'm clicking on debug. So when I'm actually doing a debugging that environment, it is actually triggering that ADF clusters in the background. And currently you are seeing that the status of that is queued over here. And after a couple of seconds down there, we should be seeing, so ideally what we are doing, copy data from dataset. This is the name of the copy data activity. We are actually doing a copy from an HTTP source to my data lake account. So that got succeeded over here. So at present, if I get back right across in here, there wasn't any file. What if I click on refresh? Let me just do that. And now you see I've got a file automatically named with the GUID global unique identifier. It is a text file because that was the extension. Let me click on top of it. And just for demonstration, let me download it. So I'm downloading this particular text file, which just got created once we executed that data copy entity. And I can pretty much have that file opened right from there and have all those values associated with that. Well, that's one thing. I just seen that my data copy actually works in here. So let me provision the cluster. So if I would like to add some data flows and all, I would like to enable the debugging of the data flows as well. And when you do that, it is asking which runtime engine we would like to use. And the moment I click OK, it will make the cluster ready. And that might take maybe 4 to 5 to 6 up to sometimes 10 minutes down the line to make that cluster up and running. But the moment that will be up and running, we will come back right over here and start working with multiple options, adding multiple data flows and transformations. In the meanwhile, let me go back in here and let me click on the data factories down there. One which I have, the ADF02, the one which I just created. What if I click on author and monitor? I'm opening it up in a secondary tab. So I can see I've got some pipelines, some of the unpublished changes over here, which we will publish, of course. But right now I'm in here, and let's say I'm on the home area. What if I click on that author area? And now you're seeing the pipelines, data sets, data flows. Currently nothing appearing over here because none of them is published as of now. That's fine. Let's see what I'm doing next. I'm clicking on that manage area where we can have the integration runtimes, the GitHub configurations, the linked services associations. So I would like to create a linked service. We already have one for the data lake storage. Let's say I would like to create a couple of more. So I'm clicking new over here. And this time I would like to create a new connection to one of my existing data source from where I can get the data. And just for demonstration, let's say that is going to be some of the services and applications. And having said that, I would like to make it from Dynamics 365, for example. I'm clicking on continue. So I'm actually creating a linked service, a connection to my data source, which is indeed a business app directly from Microsoft. So let's see, how do we do that? We need to specify the name of the connection. So let's call it GTL D365 linked service connection, whatever you would like to name it. And is it going to be an on-premises deployment, on-prem deployment, or an online deployment? In my case, let's say it's online right across in here. Then we need to specify the URL of that Dynamics 365 instance. And having said that, let's just do that. I'm specifying gtechlearn.crm8.dynamics.com, for example. I would like to log in myself with my Office 365 authentication. Let me quickly have that value provided. Ideally, it should be a generic administrative account down there. Well, let me just have that listed over here. So I just specified all these values. I'm clicking on test connection. It is actually testing a connection from Azure Data Factory to Dynamics 365. It could be your Amazon cloud as well. It could be your Salesforce. It could be multiple third-party services which are available. So the connection is successful. Let me create this linked service. So important thing, the term, what we were seeing over there, a linked service, it is ideally a connection to various data sources down there from where we can get the data and store it into our data sets. That's fine. Let's say if I would like to create another linked service over here, how does it work? we can start working with all those values associated, whether it's your MongoDB, Azure Files, Key Vault, Azure SQL databases, big data, anything like across in there, FTPs, GitHubs, or anything associated with that can be created as a linked service over there. The data set from where we can create multiple values associated in here, we can have our data sets created. Now you can see that I've got these notifications. So if I click in here, it's cluster, it's getting that cluster ready. The moment the cluster gets ready, we can start performing multiple operations down there. An example of that could be, let's say I would like to go for a data flow. So I want to go for the data flows in here. Now you can see that it's just telling me the cluster is ready. So I'm dragging my data flow right across in here. Is it going to be a new data flow for preparations, or let me click a mapping data flow, a code-free data transformation at large scale data down there. Let me click OK. All right. And there where I have my data flows listed, I can add a different source over here from where the data will be coming up. So let's say my data will be coming up from a data set, and the one which I created is my CSV from HTTPS, where I'll be having that data associated. You want to see something? Let's click on data preview. So if you come up over here, you can have all these values listed. What if I would like to have the data from my destination data set where I was having that data listed? Let me test this connection real quick from where I'm actually getting that particular data. And I can see my data preview associated with that, the way we are presenting that particular data listing. At the same point of time, once we are testing that connection, once you click on that plus icon, you can have lots of transformation activities from here. You can join data, you can have conditional values, exist, not exist, you can have select, or you can have pivot, unpivot, different windows, filters, all those values in here. So let's take an example. What if I would like to get that data? In this case, instead of using an existing one, what if I would like to create a new database? And that time it's going to be from a file or from a data lake storage or whatever value you want to specify in there. You can always have it. When you move to the data preview area and you click on refresh, ideally you should be seeing that data from that particular source right across coming up and appearing right across in here. So on top of it, you can apply your select operations, you can apply your filters, you can apply your joins down the line, and you can sync it to a different place altogether. So let's get it done once we are fetching that particular data from a different data source right across in here. And once we are done, we can pretty much add multiple activities. So I'm seeing all these values appearing right across in here. What next in there? So what if I would like to click on that activity and I'm bringing up a select transformation over here. When I say I'm talking about a select transformation, important thing to notice, from where the value will come from the source. That is my incoming stream. The output stream, the name of that, let's call it select operation, whatever you want to make it, and that's going to be the select operation which is selecting the data. What if you would like to change the mappings and all those values? You can always do that. On top of it, let's say I would like to apply some sort of filter down there. You can apply the filter, multiple columns, values and all. Once you're done with all that, it's talk about where we are going to sync that particular data. When all the operation gets completed, I might want to store it in one of my Azure Synapse Analytics database, or I might want to send it to my Azure Databricks for big data analytics and all. So you can talk about where that data is going to go and which data source that's going to be stored right across in there. You can specify multiple linked services and putting that data connections in here. Important thing is, once you have 10, 20 different values over there with the pipelines and all, you can click on validate all and see if you've got any validation related errors. If not, I'm clicking on publish all. I'm seeing 5 in the yellow area down there. Let me publish this particular pipeline and all these changes will be published right across. So let's just get it done. It is saying publishing, and the moment it does, I would be seeing these yellow icons are gone because all the changes are published. So whenever you do that, you can always publish all these values associated that. And at the end, you can pretty much run, you can debug that particular data flow. I've got this pipeline. Let me close it over here. I see this pipeline, this is copying the data, and maybe I would like to connect it right across in here if I'm treating that as one of my data source, and I can have multiple data flows down there. There is one unpublished object now, which I just made the connection. So let me quickly publish that real quick in here. And once I do that, I can pretty much run this entire pipeline down the line. So it is deploying my changes. Currently, if you remember, I didn't enable Git control. The version control wasn't enabled. I can control it anytime for further branchings, continuous CI/CD pipelines and all. That can be done. Let's see what I'm doing next in here. I'm clicking on debug this particular pipeline. So it will debug that pipeline and I will be able to monitor it right over here in the pipeline runs, trigger runs, and all those particular areas down there. So it's running in the background. They'll do and then will work as for my data flows, all those operations down there. If I take you back in here, there was one quick area, one quick demonstration, which was talking about how does an Azure Data Factory actually works. Now, I might have data from multiple data sources using linked services the way I represented. Could be from a text file, CSVs, could be from XMLs. It could be from multiple data sources in terms of Dynamics 365 or Amazon AWS and all. And once you have it, have your transformations applied in there, sync your data to the target source, and you should be good to go when you talk about those activities listings down there. So there was one quick area which was talking about Azure Data Factory in here. Now, and that's pretty much what we had for this very brief session. Now, no need to say that. We can extend that demonstration for 6 to 8 continuous hours by putting up multiple business logics and multiple use cases down there. But because of the limited time, that's what we had as part of that. Now, don't forget to see some of the upcoming events from us related to Microsoft Azure, related to D365 finance and operations and all, and that can pretty much take you right from there. So whenever you talk about some of the upcoming events, you can always visit us on our site, and there you got the events listed where you can register yourself for any of those upcoming events down there. Now, before we move to the next thing, let's spend a couple of more minutes now. I'm gonna open the chat window for questions. So let's see if you've got some questions in here. Let me quickly have the chat enabled for everyone. So let's have your questions on the chat, guys. That is what we had as today's demonstration. All right, your questions on the chat. Great. So in the meanwhile, that was what we exactly have as part of Azure Data Factory. Important thing, a question coming up, is the session actually recorded in here? Well, yes, the session is recorded. You would be seeing the link, the email coming up from the team talking about the recorded URL where you can revisit that. When you talk about working up on finance and operations at a data source, the answer is absolutely yes. You can always do that. You had Dynamics AX listed over there, but Dynamics 365, you can have it from the finance and operations as well. You can have common data services as your data source. Some of the important thing when we talk about the whole process, the basic idea behind that is whatever extract, transformation, load processes you want to do, get the data collected from n number of data sources, have some transformations applied over there using data flows down there, and then have your data synced to any of the places wherever you want, make this process streamlined. And the collection of all those activities will combinedly make a pipeline. What are the available data sources? Important thing, whenever you talk about a linked service, whatever services you are seeing where you are able to make a linked service connection, you can have the data gathered from there and store it in your data sources down there. Important thing, what if you have concurrent executions, you can always have it. What if multiple people are working on the pipelines and making some changes? You can have your Git configuration down there. You can have your Azure DevOps configurations right across in there. Now, important thing when we talk about the end user's perspective, well, um, let's consider it as a data orchestration tool for data flows and having data transformations. And using Azure Data Factory, the business case scenarios, what used to take a couple of days down the line for analysis and in different formattings, different tools, we can streamline that entire process right across in here and have that automated and let the Azure Data Flow Cloud Service do the work for you. Great. Okay, cool. So these were a couple of services which we were talking about, Azure Data Factory, couple of components, a very small demonstration as part of that. And that was what we planned as part of today's webinar, guys. Keep tuning us to our social media channels. Like us if you pretty much like the video. It'll be uploaded to the YouTube channel very soon. And pretty much you can start registering yourself for the no-cost events in the future dates and see if you can analyze or you can gather some of the information related to Microsoft Azure right from there. So thank you very much, guys. That's what we had in here. Now, a couple of last questions. Replacement of SSIS, not really. People are still using it, but as the organization starts moving to the cloud, so you can say it's pretty much a cloud version of your SSIS plus 80% more what you were not able to achieve in SSIS. You can pretty much have it right over here with the availability of different sources down there. Okay, great. So thank you very much, guys. Thanks for tuning us with us today. This was Kuldeep Singh on Azure Data Factory. We'll keep working up in future events and we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.